Can you walk us through the involvement and what it was like spinning up for it and kind of where your mind was at?
Yeah, I'll say this. And you and I were talking before we started this that, you had Mark Ciccone on here recently. Mark was one of my former guys. He's a good friend, great guy. I would love to sarcastically say, yeah, just a typical average boring guy, not unique at all, which is totally untrue if anybody listens to the interview. He's an exceptional guy. And he talked about Bosnia and talked about how he was really fascinated how complex it was. Incredibly complicated. The Army, well, the military, not just the Army of the 90s is worth talking about for a second. Because I think you came in, what year did you join?
96.
Yeah. So it's that same time period. It was not great. In my opinion, we were really lost after the end of when the Cold War collapsed. And we went into this risk-averse period. We couldn't figure out what we were doing. And these crises kept blowing up from, I'll say, if you think of it this way, you had the Gulf War in 1991, one of the greatest military victories that the world's ever seen. Almost like I sometimes jokingly refer to as the consolation prize for the end of the Cold War. We had trained to fight the Soviets. That match isn't going to happen, so you can fight this high school team, and it was like the Yankees going up against the high school team. That's the way the Gulf War sort of looked. Our standing was great after that, but the point to this is how quickly a military culture can atrophy if things are not quite right. So 1992, Somalia starts, 93, Blackhawk Down takes place, and that puts us on this trajectory where we're just confused. We're 100% risk averse. Any operation we're going to conduct cannot have a risk of casualties. Rwanda kicks off, and the United States kind of waffled to stay out of Rwanda, and continuously acted like we just didn't know what was going on. Bosnia was then going on. And the international community, mostly under the UN flag, but it was mostly the NATO partners, kept saying, we need the U.S. to join. And the United States, we were dragging our feet, not wanting to get into this scary, embroiled, weird conflict of Bosnia. And frankly, for anybody who remembers, Bosnia in 92, 93, and 94 was horrific. We weren't there. It was a UN peacekeeper mission, and the fighting was brutal. And a lot of our European partners really suffered very, very heavily amidst some really weird fighting. Finally, in 95, the pressure was such that the United States had to intervene. We literally were forced. There's a great saying by Winston Churchill, talking about good quotes. You can always rely on the Americans to do the right thing after they've expended all other options. But that's kind of the way it felt. So we were, in 95, we transitioned into a NATO command, and the United States now joined. And that did sort of trigger a new ceasefire against the warring factions. So by the time we joined, the fighting was largely over. And I say this, I was on the first wave of guys going in December of 95. Yeah. And it literally was like piles of rubble still smoking. That's exactly what it was when we showed up. And all of our NATO partners had been there for a couple of years, and they had taken a lot of casualties and seen a lot of really rough stuff. The first couple of years for us, the United States, were super weird because it's like we agreed to go, but we are not going to do anything. So the conventional forces largely went to a base up in the north in a place called Tuzla, and they did not leave that base. And as an American soldier, you were indoctrinated that if you set foot on not hard terrain, you will die from a mine. We were told that there was a mine every 3 inches, and there was no way you could survive in this environment. So the soldiers were terrified to step off a road. Special forces got involved, and I would say this was, in my opinion, it was not a good use of special forces. For the first couple of years, they did what was called liaison coordination elements. That's a little bit different. Mark was, a couple of weeks ago, talking a latter version of where this went. The first couple of years of this was we took six-man special forces teams and assigned them to every NATO partner as a liaison element. And, if I have friends in the community we did a great job. I'm not saying you didn't do a great job. I'm saying I don't think it was a particularly great use of special forces because the conventional forces, and I'm talking about a liaison team to the British, to the French, to the Dutch. There was a couple of odd ones, like the Malaysians that showed up, but mustering a 6-person team that would be comfortable liaising with the British, I don't know if it's a special forces mission. We did a great job. We did a very good job for the 2 years that we did it. What Mark was talking about the other day was the British SAS have been doing something called joint JCOs, Joint Commission Observers. they were living out in the communities, largely providing intelligence and fidelity of what was really going on. And they did it because it was very dangerous. And it was acceptable to put, a 6-man SAS team out in these places. The point to this is, as we talk about the trajectory of this, we did that for a couple of years, and it was almost like we couldn't get out of this malaise of risk-averse stuff. Somewhere around 97, we started to suggest maybe we could do the JCO mission, which by this time was much safer, not completely safe, but much safer than when the Brits did it in 93, 94. So we let guys start doing the Joint Commission Observer mission. And it's like baby steps, because that came with some new authorities, that are related to intelligence collection and reporting on the population, a bag of money to survive. You're going to pay your rent with this money. You're going to pay your interpreters. You're going to pay locals to do certain services. So guys learned how to maturely handle a bag of money. And as you might imagine, it didn't go well for the first year.
Yeah.
That was a real thing. The first year that we gave guys a bag of $50,000 and said, manage your house, all of the interpreters were these really attractive young women that did this is a real thing. Everyone's like, here's my interpreter, Tatiana. Speak slow, her English isn't that good. If you came back 3 years later, all the 10th group guys were like, here's my interpreter, Boris. Yeah. And he's a former professional interpreter from the university. We learned those hard lessons. So that was actually valuable. When we started doing the Joint Commission Observer mission, we muddled through learning how to map the human terrain. So the guys got legitimate, good experience operating in a weird place, a little bit dangerous, thinking about force protection all the time, operating in a way that was low visibility, just because that was a smart way to do things, and managing all the weird human dynamics of the factions, the mayor, the police chief, all this crazy stuff. That was really beneficial for the guys. And we did that for a couple of years. And that's what Mark was kind of alluding to. He got a chance to do some of that. That started to get closer to, I'll say, an intelligence collection mission. Then around 97, I should also point out, in the earlier years, like 94, 95, we were rotating, and I think the SEALs were on this too, we were rotating teams on CSAR alert out of Italy for aircraft that were maintaining a no-fly zone. And the French had a plane shot down, the Brits had at least one, if not two planes shot down, and we had a couple of planes shot down over that time period. And this is important because, like, the French one in particular, one of my friends, they had recommended, hey, we could free fall in and confirm the location of these French guys in evasion, because there was an evasion signal coming out. And then once we confirm it, we'll bring in the aircraft. And the mindset was, no, that's too dangerous. We're not going to do free fall. Let's just fly in with a helicopter. Like, you know what I mean? Like, everything was very unimaginative, very, the perception was it was risk averse. So we loaded guys up on a helicopter, flew them across the Adriatic, flew to the site. It was a setup. The aircraft took a bunch of fire, ground fire. 3 people were injured. Nobody was actually really severely hurt. And the aircraft ended up evading. I say that because, like, that's an example of our willingness to conduct more than just simple special operations was very limited around 96, 97. Now suddenly we're starting to open the aperture, and in 97 we started talking about apprehending war criminals. And there were other soft national forces working on that too, but we were involved in that. Could we find them? Could we apprehend them? And it was a mess. It was very ad hoc. But there was an initial plan that we used to refer to as the Night of the Long Knives, where we're going to grab them all in the same night. And, we had our guy, the French had their guy, the Brits had their guy, everybody had their guy. Lesson learned, jumping forward. Hey, that was pretty stupid. It was too big, too complex, and too many different countries and players were involved. So it fell apart. And around that time period, when we kept saying, hey, are we going to do this? The question we kept getting from the leadership was, can you guarantee no American casualties?
How do you guarantee?
You can't, right? Like, come on, that's a loaded question.
The recurring theme of this risk averse, from your perspective, is it solely because of Somalia and how bad that went?
I hate to say solely, but yes. And what I mean, Somalia was such a catastrophic event. And the response to it was such a knee-jerk reaction of, hey, let's pull all the troops out. And it's sort of, and I don't mean this to, I don't mean this to bash one administration or the other. Like, I mean this just as a guy looking at strategy. It created a new dynamic of, we cannot have casualties. We will not have casualties. So it just got continuously worse as more crises and opportunities to do things. And then it's like anything else. Business is the same thing. If you're not willing to assume any risk, then you're not probably going to really get any gain. You'll just be in this neutral zone. And that's kind of what we were stuck in. Keep in mind, too, by the way, I mean, the 90s, as you recall, it was a freaking mess of instability. While all this is going on, Iraq, Saddam is violating sanctions every month. He is shooting at our aircraft that are trying to maintain a no-fly zone, breaking the ceasefire. So there's continuous challenges to the U.S. authority, and it does somewhat create a perception of, hey, we're not willing to follow through if it gets ugly, which is amazing. Again, because I go back 4 or 5 years earlier was the Gulf War, and now suddenly our reputation is we don't have the stomach for combat, for taking risks. So I make this point. So like we dabbled in looking for war criminals, but not particularly seriously in 97 and 98. And that kind of takes us up to Kosovo. When Kosovo kicked off in 99, you may or may not remember this, like the U.S. military had a hard time deploying to Kosovo. Apaches crashed flying from Germany to Kosovo. They crashed in the mountains. And so like there was just this perception of it. It looked like it felt like we couldn't do stuff. That's where Mark talked about the story that he was a liaison element with the Russians, and the Russians kind of, I'll say duped us and just literally picked up in Bosnia Day and went to Kosovo and sort of occupied territory almost to make a point to NATO, like, hey, what are you doing in Kosovo? They didn't tell anybody. They just moved out. It freaked out the American-led coalition in Bosnia. So Kosovo then brewed up as like a short conflict. Like it seemed evident it was probably only going to be a few weeks. And I'll just say this, the complexities of Bosnia, I think there was a sense that from 95 to 99, we didn't do enough. We let the adversaries get away with too much. We should have been a little harder. That's a true statement for Bosnia, but we tried to apply it to Kosovo, and the scenario was different. So like in Kosovo, there was a legitimate belligerent. It was the Albanian rebels. It wasn't necessarily the Serbs. Now, I don't mean to make it sound like there was nobody whose hands were completely clean, but in that particular scenario, as Mark the other day called it, the KLA and then the UCK, they were the insurgents, and they were encroaching on sovereign territory of the country of Serbia, which is a very different situation than what was going on in Bosnia. So we went into it with this we started bombing Serbia proper, and we sort of labeled the Serbians as the belligerent, like the lesson of Bosnia. We got to pick a side and pick one side to be the good guys in the bad guys. Well, we picked the wrong side. So it took a few months for that to even out, where we realized, hey, the Albanians are not, when I say the Albanians, I don't mean the country of Albania. I mean the insurgents that are in Serbian territory. They were the bad guys. And that was the story Mark talked about, where rolling with the Russians, they rolled up on a UCK or KLA camp and got into a huge firefight. So Kosovo was now interesting because now the Special Forces guys, we've been kind of warming up for a few years. And this is some of the lost knowledge. Some of the ops in Kosovo were fantastic. Like, you don't know about the counterinsurgency in Kosovo because we broke it before it ever took hold. So we were able to apply all those really simple lessons, like understanding complex terrain, mapping the human dynamics, managing money, if you will, having authorities to do slightly more sensitive things, being mature enough to not be stupid about this leeway you have. So suddenly in Kosovo, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Simple things. And the SEALs, the guys from Team 2 were completely involved in this. The conventional guys would roll around and do patrols. We would drop guys off in the woods to set up an OP to just watch a village, fully knowing that a conventional patrol is coming. And when the conventional patrol was coming, we would then see people in the town start to signal. Whether they're waving a flag out a back window, whether cell phones are pinging, and we're like, oh, that's interesting. Somebody in that house, somebody in that house. Oh, that guy's jumping out a window, running into the woods. So the poor conventionals would roll through the town, no worse for wear, and they would leave. And then we would know that guy, and that guy, and we would go deal with them, whether we apprehended them or just arrested them or whatever. And I think the enemy, the insurgents, could not understand how we were doing this so easily and so quickly. There was a ton of stuff like that really broke the Albanian insurgents back. I mean, the SEALs and the Special Forces guys really did an exceptional job, and it was largely based on the experience of the previous years. he talked about the JCO mission. I did want to mention this because you asked him a question about when the SEALs got involved in this. So I hope this doesn't sound bad, but I don't mean it in a bad way. But back in the '96 time period, we didn't operate as close as we used to. Like now, I know a bunch of SEALs. Back in those days, we really didn't cross past that much. SOCUR and EUCOM wanted to get the Navy contingent involved in Bosnia, but they didn't know how. So the first go-around was, hey, let's have them do part of the JCO mission. But the command wasn't completely comfortable giving them houses. So their solution was, let's split the teams in half. And Mark said, hey, it was great. He loved his SEAL counterparts. But like when we heard that was an insane idea. We're like, you want me to, I'm going to go lead the SEAL team, and the SEAL team leadership's going to go lead my team. And like, yes. And we did that for a couple of years. It was weird. For the most part, it worked out fine. But that was the background of why we did it that way. It was to sort of help spread some of the experience and knowledge throughout the force.
One of the things you've mentioned a couple times is the complexities of Bosnia, Serbia, the mid to late 90s, and how much more complex it is than what I think most people think or even realize. To me, it's really that way with everything.
Absolutely.
Because most people are exposed to the 30-second mainstream media, good guy versus bad guy, and it's very cut and dry. It's very black and white. But to me, I don't think it's specific just to that. I think that because it was a lower visibility, generally speaking, in the media and in pop culture, there's far less known about it. But I don't think Israel and Gaza or Russia and Ukraine and the surrounding contiguous countries are any simpler.
No, I think that's exactly accurate. I've heard you talk about that before. It's a great lesson for anybody involved in this, young military guys or whatever, that hey, you can plan whatever you want. Until you get on the ground, you need to be aware that it's going to feel and look different. And like, I've been involved in a lot of things where we were talking about going to this country, going to that country, and you got to stop and ask, like, hey, is there anybody in this planning session from there? Like, I work with a lot of international guys now, and if it's just a group of Americans who've never been to that terrain who are talking about what we're going to do when we get there, okay, you should take note. That's a mistake, because you're going to learn when you're there how different. Like, I know it's a New York thing. Think about where you grew up, and if some foreign military guys went to your town, how long would it take them driving around in their MRAPs and not opening the doors to actually know what's going on in these down every back alley?
Oh, forever.
They would never figure it out.
Yeah.
Where if you've got a local. And I don't, we could go down stories about Iraq and Afghanistan where a local's like, hey, that guy's accent's not from here. Or that guy, the way he's wearing a scarf that's not the way they do it here. You would never figure that out.
Yeah.
And asking for 2 more ISR birds isn't going to help you.
Yeah.
That kind of benefit, that fidelity of understanding the human dynamic is super valuable.
Agreed. I think the there's two parts of that make it difficult, though, is one, just knowing that. There's some people that I think learn that the hard way. But even if you understand that, and using Iraq as a good example, and I have no doubt it's probably similar stuff in Bosnia and Serbia and everything, Croatia, et cetera. But, to use your analogy of New York, well, if your local guy that you're using as a source is a fucking mob guy, it's going to be very different. Yeah. It's, hey, that Irish Catholic family, they're fucking no good. Like you run into this tribal.
Yeah.
Like even the local guy that you're picking needs to be the right fucking guy.
And that's really funny you said that, because Mark made me think of something he was talking today. Rightly so. He was like, hey, the Serbs are great people. They are. They're absolutely great people. And the Bosnians and the Croats are great people too. And what we found was the teams, all the teams did this. Where they were living, they'd all come back to the headquarters and they'd be like, hey, and they were completely slanted. They're like, the good guys here are these guys. Like they've been really the victims of this whole thing.
Yeah.
And it took a little bit of work to train the guys, but also like to, I'll say indoctrinate the guys that, hey, you need to step back and make sure we're staying objective, and be conscious that we're susceptible. Like we have a saying, I don't know if you guys use it too, like, go with the natives, don't go native. It's a training point that you need to be aware. Like, hey, when you hang out with these people after a while, you're going to empathize with them, and you may become biased. It may skew you, and some of that's fine. Just remember that in the back of your head, that there's 2 sides to every story.
Yeah.
So it's an important educational point for anybody who's going to do that kind of work.
No, for sure.
And also that you also might be getting told a story that's not true at all. Like if it's that mafia guy or whoever, that's a part of that. If you work in that environment, you need to be aware of that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge problem, especially in the early days in Iraq, using interpreters and local sources where there was these tribal issues where it had nothing to do with, the war on terror or counterinsurgency. It was, hey, this family or, they're supporting Al-Qaeda. Well, they weren't. It's just they owed the guy's dad money and so.
Karlovich, that's the lesson of how to use the Americans as a weapon.
Yeah.
And it happens at all levels. It happens at detachments. It happens at the United States government level. In Bosnia, one of the things that broke the conflict, it was a famous event at the time, there was a mortar attack at the marketplace in downtown Sarajevo. And Sarajevo, for anybody who saw it at that time, it was overwhelming, just like Ukraine is now in Gaza. It was a beautiful European city at one time, and it was just devastated. I describe it, the scenes of the future in any Terminator movie, that's what it looked like. Yeah. Like there was bodies and broken stuff and smoldering piles everywhere. And a mortar attack took place in this marketplace that killed 60 civilians. And the United States was outraged by this. And it was, you got it, it was emotional, it was horrifying. And we responded by bombing the Serb positions that were in a ring around Sarajevo. After more scrutiny, you could have figured out pretty quickly that mortar couldn't have ranged from those mountains. It was self-detonated. And to their credit, that was really a brilliant move in some way. They sacrificed 60 of their own people. And somebody might say, well, you can't prove that. That's at least what we concluded after the fact. They did it to trigger a response from us, and it worked to their favor. Again, the Serbs were brutal to them, and we're besieging that city, and that's how they used us. They got us to knee-jerk respond. And there's examples of that, constantly going on.
Yeah. Was there a hairiest moment for you operationally during that phase of your career?
No, for the most part, Bosnia was pretty benign. Like I said, it looked scary, and it was a small amount of danger. But we were there after the danger had subsided. I did a couple of things in Africa that were pretty interesting. We can talk about that in a moment if you want. But Iraq was the craziest stuff I ever did.
Yeah. Okay. Does the Africa stuff fall between Bosnia and Iraq? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to move into that then. Before we get into even the pre-Iraq invasion info that you're privy to that I definitely want to dive into, but what was the mission and purpose of your time in Africa?
So I had transitioned to C-110, which was the SIF at that time. We don't have those anymore, but at that time, it was a specialized company with higher CQB skills. And the U.S. Embassy, this was going on in Africa constantly. Like every 6 months, there was a similar issue, but this was the biggest one that I experienced. The embassy was under siege, if you will, because rule of law had collapsed, rioting was in the streets, and let's just say for the second, it sort of looked Blackhawk Downish, like mobs of thousands running around the streets, shooting in the air, shooting each other. It was just really bad. So they called for an evacuation of the U.S. Embassy.
What country is this?
Liberia, sorry. So what's interesting is last week something had happened. A U.S. diplomatic plane crashed in outside of Bosnia, just on the Kosovo or near the Kosovo-Bosnia border. This diplomatic plane crashed. So we launched forces from Stuttgart, platoon from SEAL Team 2, and a platoon from B-110. They raced to do a recovery of the crash site. We then got alerted to go to Liberia, and the SEAL platoon that was on the border doing this launched from there. And I jokingly say they beat us to the objective literally by like 15 minutes. Wow. And the point of that was we went from Stuttgart to Spain, and from Spain we launched to Sierra Leone. And by the time I got to Sierra Leone, we had met up with the 53s, the MH-53s, which was our helicopter. That was our only helicopter at that time, from Mildenhall, England. As soon as we all landed in Sierra Leone, somebody comes running up screaming, "The embassy's under attack, the embassy's under attack. Who can move right now?" So I was the first element that happened to be ready. I got on the first aircraft and moved out. The SEAL platoon, like I said, was literally 15 minutes ahead of us, coming from a different route. They fast roped into the compound and pulled down multiple light poles. My bird then came in to a cleared LZ, and it hit several branches coming in, but I was in the second bird coming in. And we just dispersed, secured the corners of the embassy compound, somewhat stabilized things. Like the fighting in the street, everybody kind of got it that building has U.S. soldiers on it, and they will shoot back, so leave it alone. But then we started to evacuate people who needed non-combatants to get out of the city. We were in the capital, Monrovia, and we started bringing 53s in at nighttime. We couldn't do it in daylight because they would take fire. And I'll just say we evacuated somewhere in the order of 2,500 people over the course of 5 days. Wow. It was 60 MH-53 lifts to get people out. Of the 2,500 that we evacuated, chances are only about 600 were Americans. And I make that point like, that was a big deal. Like, we've got all these people rushing to the embassy. We've got to sort out who they are. They're British nationals, they're French nationals, they're, Brazilian nationals, they're from everywhere. And yeah, we were really excited. Like, the United States was really excited. We're going to be able to get you out of here. The only other weird thing I will say about that is, so we're bringing these people into our compound. Fighting is crazy in the streets. It's just insane. And, they'd shoot at us sometimes, but there was kind of they eventually figured out that's not a good idea. We stopped evacuating in daylight. We were only evacuating at night. They shut the power and the water off to the compound. And I will say, it's Africa, and it was 100 degrees, and we have no running water. I can say to 100% certainty, every single one of us was out of water because. Imagine if it could be this room. Imagine if you've got 35 women and children in this room, and the kids are crying, everybody's freaked out. As a soldier, sailor, whatever, you could not take your canteen out and give it to a lady to give to her kids. Anything we had, food, water. So all of us, we're like, when was the last time you drank something? I'm like, it's been 24 hours. Our heads are pounding, but we took care of the civilians first. It was a really noble. It felt really noble, like we would die for these people. We knew we would. And we got them all out. It was all, they all made their way to Sierra Leone and then onward to somewhere else from there. But it was called Assured Response, Operation Assured Response. That's the biggest one I've ever done, but there were multiple others in Brazzaville and Congo and Zaire, Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone 2 years previous. That became a constant thing in Africa in the 90s.
Of having to do
non-combatant evacuations.
Yeah. Wow. That was the hairiest one of the ones that you did.
Yeah, because it always felt like we were right on the cusp of this could explode into a powder keg at any moment.
Yeah. Wow.